We have a special show in store for you. Our special guests are Jim Brophy and Margaret Keith. You may have heard of them or seen them in the documentary, The Disappearing Male. They have also been seen in Toxic Trespass, The Beloved Community, and Homo Toxicus. And they've done a lot of, actually, they've been in the field of occupational health for 30 years, and for 17 of those years, Jim was the executive director of the Occupational Health Clinic for Ontario workers in Windsor, and then later in Sarnia, Ontario, and that's where they started their studies in the First Nations community and the rate of the declining male. We are going to get into this and the household toxins, and even in the air you breathe, in the things you drink from. They are right now working on another study. They've been working on 15 years about breast cancer and occupational hazards. So please listen up, stay tuned, and take notes. I'm going to post a link here in the text chat if you'd like to join us. That's over at TruthBrigade.com. And you can check out all those links and the documentaries because they are just extremely explosive. Some of the petrochemicals, well, they actually come from an area of Canada called the Chemical Valley. It was monikered, they're given that name because of the 54 facilities, chemical plants in the area, and the 5 refineries that their studies have showed directly correlates with the reduction in males. You know, we started a couple minutes late here. So good news, we are going to skip the break and bring on our guest right away. Jim, thank you so much for being here tonight. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Christie. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, I was just talking a little bit about the documentary, The Disappearing Male, and some of the other ones you've been in, Toxic Trespass, The Beloved Community, and Homo Toxicus. The Disappearing Male, I mean, wow, I love that name, and we have discussed some of the toxins that we are exposed to in our environment, but you've been studying the correlation between occupational hazards and health risks. So I just want to thank you so much for your time. If you could you tell us about the disappearing male and your research that led up to the discoveries in that documentary?
Well, the work we were doing, I think, was kind of part of a larger picture. It's been known for some time that in many industrial countries, over the last 30 years, there's been a consistent lowering of the ratio of boys being born to girls. The normal ratio is about 50-50, a slightly increased number of boys than girls, but essentially, about the same number. But what we've been witnessing in countries like the United States, for instance, or Japan or Canada, has been this lowering of the number of boys being born to girls. And so there's been lots of questions about, what the significance of all of that has been. I should also mention that I'm talking to you tonight from Windsor, Ontario, which is across from Detroit, Michigan, and right in the middle, if you will, of the Great Lakes that divide or are shared, if you will, between the United States and Canada. And for about 30 or 40 years, there's been a tremendous amount of research activity going on in the wildlife, the fish, the bird populations that exist in the Great Lakes Basin. And what they've been finding there, of course, is all kinds of examples of reproductive harm. A small community, for instance, that's just about 40, 50 miles from here, Wheatley, they found, as an example, snapping turtles there that couldn't reproduce because the penis size was so small that literally was impossible to reproduce.
Wow.
And they, and there's lots of hypotheses about this, but that's just one small example. I mean, they were finding all kinds of examples in the bird population, in the fish population, where, the genders, were mixing. They would find male and female sex organs in the same, animal or bird or fish or so on, or amphibian. So there's been all this background to this, but in the human population, it's very hard to track. And so what happened, I was the director at that time at the Occupational Health Clinic in Sarnia, and maybe later we can discuss, the kind of the work that we were doing there was essentially helping the blue-collar workers of Sarnia, which is the center of the chemical industry in Canada, with the tremendous amount of asbestos disease that they had. And in the midst of that, I was actually coming from Windsor, Ontario, about 100 miles away. In the midst of it, I started becoming aware of all the pollution. I mean, it's pretty hard to go into Sarnia, which is, many, over 40 chemical plants, and not be aware that there's something going on with the air. And, but there wasn't seemingly a great deal of community activity around it, which was surprising. But in 2000, there was a major spill of benzene. In fact, probably one of the largest spills of benzene ever to occur in Canada. And there's a First Nations reserve, the Aamjiwnaang community, that sits right at the fence line with many of these plants. In fact, many of the plants are on former First Nations land. And we were helping workers that were getting sick, that had been exposed to benzene and had developed health problems, and were quite concerned about, their potential risk of developing blood-related diseases and even cancer and so forth. And we had this public meeting, and at this public meeting, we had doctors and others there to explain, what are the health problems associated with benzene exposure, and what kinds of tests would be appropriate and so forth. And a number of members in the audience were actually from the First Nations community, and they were there because their community had been very exposed. In fact, there had been representatives of the particular petrochemical facility, management representatives, had been taking air samplings on the fence line with the Aamjiwnaang community, and had told the First Nations that they were getting readings that were 5 and 6 times higher than occupational limits, health limits, which are very high in ambient air, in general air for to have those kind of high levels of benzene exposure. So they were very concerned, and so that's just started a discussion that we had with our clinic with members of the Aamjiwnaang community, and we discovered that they had been worried for some time about what was going on in particularly with the health of their children. And when I asked them specifically, they were concerned about, miscarriages that were happening, high rates of asthma, high rates of learning disabilities, compared to other First Nations communities and compared to the non-Aboriginal communities around them. So we started, a series of, investigations. We collected all kinds of information. And at one of the meetings, a biologist who had been very involved, he actually had retired from the International Joint Commission, which is an agency of the U.S. and Canadian government on the Great Lakes. He had been a scientist that had actually found, one of the first defects among herring gulls on the Great Lakes, reproductive effects. He asked them, I should mention his name, it was Michael Gilbertson. He asked the Environment Committee of the First Nations, did they notice any problem of boys being born? And they really thought that somebody had told a family secret or something. They all looked at each other and said, well, we've had a lot of difficulties. We haven't been able to have, boy baseball teams. At the daycare center, which, was a center for the First Nations children, pre-kindergarten children, there were hardly any boys. And so we got the records from the health unit, And we discovered in a 20-year period that there had been a substantial drop in the number of boys being related to the number of girls being born. In fact, in some periods, almost a whole year, there were no boys being born at all.
Wow.
And so we also ran a check with another First Nations community, because one of the other effects that can trigger some of these abnormalities, like, lower boy populations, could be things like poverty or even like some lifestyle effects. So we checked what were the birth ratios of another First Nations community that lived upwind from the Aamjiwnaang community, but were related culturally and nationally, if you will, to the Aboriginal community in the Sarnia area, and their birth ratio was right at the Canadian average. So clearly, it wasn't something about First Nations or Aboriginal genetics, if you will, or poverty even, or lifestyle. There was nothing different about these two communities, except where they lived. And so we ended up having these findings published in the Environmental Health Perspectives in the United States, and that triggered an amazing response from scientists around the world who have been tracking this issue of reproductive problems and issues of sperm quantity and quality, of infertility, and a whole host of other reproductive issues that they believe are associated with environmental exposures.
And so these are all petrochemicals, the benzene that you're describing here, and then the phthalates I was reading about earlier.
Yes, I mean, Sarnia is one of the chemical centers of Canada, if not the chemical center. It is one of the largest industrial concentrations in Canada. It sits right in the heart of the Great Lakes Basin. Lake Huron is on one side of it, and the St. Clair River, which connects ultimately to Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, is on the other side. In 2005, we were involved in a report where we used the National Pollution Release Inventory, which is very similar to the American Toxic Release Inventory, TRI, I think it's called. And we looked at what were the releases going on within a 25-kilometer radius from the First Nations reserve. Mm-hmm. And we found that, there was over 5.7 million kilograms of toxic air pollutants being released out of these facilities. There were 62 large facilities within a 25-mile radius of Sarnia and the adjacent Aamjiwnaang community. It was the largest toxic release of any community in Ontario. It was releasing more toxic substances than the whole province of British Columbia. And it was releasing literally millions of tons of climate-changing greenhouse gases. Mm-hmm. And there was an enormous number of reproductive. There was over 10 million kilograms of pollutants that are suspected of causing reproductive and developmental problems, including almost 250,000 kilograms of suspected endocrine-disrupting compounds. So this was an unbelievable level of exposure that, we had been witnessing, not just the effects from this, but throughout the Great Lakes Basin from other sources as well, the effect it was having on the wildlife, fish, bird populations. But this was one of the first times where we really were observing and documenting the effect it was having on human communities.
So basically the only difference in your research between the two communities was the location.
That's right.
Wow. Now, are these chemicals, benzene, are we breathing them, or are these particular communities breathing them? I mean, I know that they're in toys and shampoos and, skin lotions, and we'll talk about that later. But it must be in the air then.
Well, what I'm talking about here were air releases.
Okay.
So these were substances that were literally going up the stack. And there had been other, examinations of this by Canadian federal government agencies. For instance, they had a task force, Environment Canada had a task force on refineries. And they looked at the 4 refineries that were in the Sarnia area. And the industry had been complaining, that it wasn't fair that they were always being compared to other refineries that didn't do similar work. And so in this particular task force, they said, well, okay, you tell us what refineries we should be comparing everybody to. And so the industry actually provided the other refineries, including American refineries. And what was found was that the refineries in Sarnia were emitting, for instance, volatile organic compounds, VOCs, and benzene, for instance, at levels far in excess of what the other refineries were releasing. We literally have had a situation where I guess, whoever is in charge has been asleep at the switch, because we've had, clearly very, very hazardous and toxic releases being accepted and tolerated year after year after year.
So asleep at the wheel or getting paid off?
Well, it's very hard to say how all of this works. I mean, that's a little bit beyond, I don't know that answer, but I what I can observe is that clearly there is no governmental agency that is standing on the side of the populations at risk, which would be everybody from who's living downwind to the people who are producing these products, who's standing on their side, really, protecting their health and preventing exposures to chemicals that are irrefutably dangerous and toxic.
Wow. Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this. I mean, according to the Disappearing Male, sperm count, due to the correlation of these chemicals, has fallen dramatically. In fact, boys today are producing 50% less than their father, and 85% of that sperm is abnormal. So, I mean, I guess essentially, over the past 30 years, they say that it's amounted to 3 million fewer baby boys than normally would be produced.
Right. Well, I mean, yes. I mean, these are pretty significant and powerful findings. I mean, we're talking now about the ability of the human population to reproduce. If you start, having an effect on the genetics and on the ability, the reproductive capacity of any, population, human or wildlife or fish or whatever, the long-term implications are that you are going to diminish, to say the least, this particular population. So, that the long-term significance of something like this, and this is mostly being found, I should point out, in industrialized countries where, the highest exposures to these substances has at least been ongoing in the last, 40 or 50 years, although I have to acknowledge that a lot of hazardous compounds and substances and processes are now being parked in developing countries. So it's likely that the effects we're seeing here, will be spread to other places that don't have that same history of, for instance, of the diminishing birth populations and so on. But the other part of this, besides, just the reproductive health part, there's links to all of this to significant diseases in the populations that, go on to live, that actually survive.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is one of the issues that we now know from what our understanding is on endocrine disrupting compounds that mimic hormones, that these substances are capable of causing not just, boys to be miscarried, but also the ones that survive to have all kinds of, susceptibilities, just like the First Nations community was finding in their, among their own community, learning disabilities, increased risk for cancer, reproductive problems, asthma. There's a host of issues that are associated with these exposures.
They even mention hyperactivity disorder, Tourette, cerebral palsy, and dyslexia, and boys are 4 times as likely to be autistic. Another startling fact was that they had found that their sexual organs were 1/3 the normal size, and that genetical defects has increased by 200% just in the past 2 decades.
Yeah, I mean, this we don't know that about the Aamjiwnaang community, some of the things you mentioned, but I think in general, in the broader the overview, if you will, of the population as a whole, these are health problems that have been, documented. Unfortunately, our healthcare systems and our public health care systems in both the United States and Canada.
Sorry about that last break. I don't know, my Skype demons or something going on. I didn't quite hear the music cue till it was over, so I apologize about that, Jim. Jim,
no problem.
You mentioned before the break some of the areas that you were in study. I'm wondering, what about across the lake in Michigan? Has anyone done any correlational studies with how the hazards are affecting the population there?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think that there has been a lot of concern in Michigan and in other American states that are on the Great Lakes. Some of the really important work in animal and fish studies were done in the United States. I think, and some of the work, for instance, around PCB consumption for women who ate fish during their pregnancies, and then the impact it had on their offspring, on their children, that was done in Detroit and in Michigan. So I think that there's been a lot of concern in certain sections of the scientific community, and certainly in the environmental community and in the public health community in both the United States and Canada about the effect of toxic substances on, everything from cancer to reproductive health. And also lots of concern by many scientists in both countries about what the implications are to watch all this harm occurring in wildlife and fish and bird populations, and then not showing any concern that these same abnormalities and problems could also be occurring in the human population, which is sharing the environment with these species and with these other life forms. So I think that there has been stuff in the United States, but I think what was unique about what happened with the Aamjiwnaang community, because they had control and knowledge about their birth records, they were a small and well-defined community. They were able to look at this, and they really were one of the first examples that we've seen of where there's this skewed sex ratio, birth ratio, occurring in a human population. And of course, its proximity to the Chemical Valley, although we can't say with absolute certainty, it certainly, it was reasonable to see that, their proximity to one of the major emitters of toxic substances in Canada might have an effect on their health.
Okay, I was reading about another study that actually, it was in Central Florida in the lakes by wildlife biologist Louis Gillette.
Yes.
My goodness. And he had found, due to the environmental hazards, that the alligators, their reproduction rate was 90% below average. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think his work has been seminal work. I mean, it was certainly highlighted in the documentary Disappearing Males. And I think he made it very clear that, that what they were observing among crocodiles was not just a phenomenon among this particular reptile or amphibian. I'm not sure which class it actually falls in, but that it had implications for all life forms, certainly for the human population and the human community. And they were looking at, pesticides, residues that have been developing in the Everglades in Florida, and they found that there was all this, altering of male sex organs and reproductive capacities in these alligators, and the effect that was having in the Everglades on the alligator populations. And I think, his work is a classic example of what I think we're talking about here, where the concern is that these chemicals are not just toxic in the sense that they're poison, but they also can be chemicals that mimic hormones. And in our bodies, hormones are the messengers. They're the chemicals that activate genes and chromosomes and cells in a certain sequence. And if you get the message if your body gets a message to do certain things in a certain timing, and you get out of sequence because your own hormones are being overridden by these other chemicals that you're being exposed to, it can have a very large and significant impact on health, on your risk for cancer, on reproductive issues, and so on and so forth. And I think that's what his work was pointing toward, and that's what I think we were certainly, arguing in the case of the Amjadong community and its skewed birth ratio was associated with these types of exposures, and that's what the kind of effect it was having.
Wow. I mean, it's obvious. Research has showed these chemicals obviously do have an effect. Another interesting fact I found out was that the chemical industry has developed more than 90,000 man-made chemicals in the last 60 years, and that 85% of them have never undergone testing for their impact on the human body.
Yeah, I mean, this is the classic example where you let the horse is completely out of the barn, and then we go, whoops, wait a second, what happened here? There's no onus on the part of the producers to test their products for their impact on health. And in addition to that, we mainly raise this, this question. It usually gets raised, particularly by occupational health and environmental health people, in relation to issues around carcinogenesis. Very small, I think 1% of the chemicals that are out there have been checked for their impact in terms of are they cancer-causing or not. But when we're talking about chemicals that mimic the hormone system, that may in fact be mimicking hormones like estrogen, there's almost none that have been looked at. So now in Europe, as an example, there's under the REACH program, the new regulations that are trying to get some control on this process, there's a major effort being made to start to look at the, first of all, whether these chemicals can alter the hormonal system or affect the hormonal system or mimic the hormonal system. And secondly, they're putting the onus on the producers to show that these chemicals are safe, rather than, just to put them out onto the market and then 15, 20 years, 30 years down the road go, whoops, we made a mistake, sorry. And, we have, a population that's literally been, unknowingly engaged in a big experiment to see whether these substances can cause harm or not.
Wow. I know that Europe seems to be a little bit more proactive in chemicals than us. They've banned quite a bit. of chemicals that we're still using here today. One thing that the disappearing male said was that only 5 of all of these 90,000 man-made chemicals, that 85% of which have never been tested, only 5 have been banned. I tried to, cross-reference that and find a little bit more evidence to that statement. Can you shed some enlightenment on that? Is that really true?
Well, I think what they were referring to, and I have to apologize because I don't really remember the specifics, which ones they were looking at. I think they're talking about a process that's going on within the federal government in Canada now, where under the environmental protection legislation, they're reviewing certain toxic substances. And of course, this process has been going on and on and on and on, as it has been in the United States. And, the frustration is that very little gets looked at because the employers mount, the most, I think that the term that I like the best, they manufacture uncertainty. They have big lobbying groups that, tie up all these regulatory processes and so on and so forth. So both our countries, there's been very little movement. But recently there was an effort to take a look at some of these substances, and the one that I think really, one of the 5 I think that really drew a lot of attention was bisphenol A, BPA, which is used in with a lot of plastics, and it was found that that babies sucking on baby bottles, on the nipples of baby bottles, were getting exposed to bisphenol A, and it's been known since the 1930s as an endocrine disruptor, that it's a very estrogenic compound, and there's been literally scores of studies done on animals and the very toxic effect and very harmful effect that it has if you get exposed at certain moments, what they call windows of vulnerability. And that raised a lot of attention in Canada, and all kinds of manufacturers and consumer organizations began to pull and demand that baby bottles and plastic children's toys with bisphenol A be taken off the market, and that has been occurring in Canada. I just forget the other substances, but I think that I think there may have been some of the phthalates may have been there, which are the plasticizers that make plastics soft and so forth. Bisphenol A is also in cans. It's used to coat food products and so forth, and there's lots of issues around that in Canada, but it's still being tolerated there. But it wasn't accepted to be used in toys for children and particularly in baby bottles.
Wow. Now, what are some of these chemicals? You talked about bisphenol A, benzene. What about PVC? Would that have BPA in it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Christie, I may have mentioned this to you before. I'm not working in Sarnia at the Occupational Health Clinic now. I'm in Windsor full time, and with Margaret Keith, my partner and co-principal investigator, we're engaged in 2 breast cancer studies. And one of the studies, we've interviewed over 1,000 women with breast cancer that were diagnosed here in Windsor, Ontario, between 2003 and 2008, and we've interviewed 1,150 women in the community that don't have the disease, and we're matching these cases and what we call controls, community controls, by age, and we're looking to see, well, what's different in these 2 populations. And we're looking at a lot of things, but one of our big areas of interest is what's their occupational differences. And one of the groups that we're really looking at are women that worked in the plastics industry. Windsor is the car capital, or was at least, like Detroit, maybe until for up to a few years ago. But in communities like Windsor, and Michigan, and Ohio, there's a tremendous industry that uses plastics to produce parts for the car industry. I mean, if you look inside of any car now, you'll find, your steering wheels and your dashboards and your glove boxes and, your armrest and, on and on and on are all plastics. And that's, why, this whole new car smell was actually plastic off-gassing,
Wow.
that we all noticed. Even
the bumpers are plastic nowadays. Jim, please hold that thought. We're rolling into a short tonight. Jim Brophy. The website is toxicfreecanada.ca. Check it out. Excellent information there. If you would, Jim, we do have a caller, but if you would, please continue where you left off before we went to break.
Well, as I said in this case of the breast cancer studies, one of the areas that we're particularly interested in, because as I mentioned, the large number of workers that are involved in plastics molding operations, was to look to see whether these women, because these industries are predominantly women, so that's who is the predominant group that works there, what kinds of risk they might have for breast cancer. And we're still very early in the process of looking at that. But one of the things we've been doing is holding focus groups and doing scientific literature reviews and so forth. And what you find, there's a host of chemicals that are common in the plastics industry that are both, mammary carcinogens based on animal evidence, that these substances cause breast cancer in animals, and many of them are endocrine disrupting. So, for instance, you mentioned benzene. I could mention acrylonitrile, which is very common. In fact, a very common plastic component is what they call ABS, acrylonitrile, butadiene, and styrene. Styrene is another common one. And then you mentioned polyvinyl chloride, and of course vinyl chloride and polyvinyl chloride are both known to cause breast cancer in animal studies, and it's also a very common product. But one of the things that has been a great frustration to me over the last 30 years where I've been engaged in this kind of work is how blue-collar industrial workers and their communities sit below the public health radar. We talk about bisphenol A as an example and babies being exposed, and I think it's a very crucial issue, and I think babies are particularly vulnerable. As I mentioned, there's these windows of vulnerability that come with chemicals that mimic hormones, and even very small amounts, if they come at a crucial moment, can have a very powerful effect. But there are women working in these industries that are being exposed on a daily basis, not only to substances that cause cancer, breast cancer in animals, but also that are also chemicals that mimic estrogen. So these women are being exposed to estrogenic compounds in the course of the work that they do every day from the fumes off these injection molding machines. And we're talking about thousands of women now that are having this, across both of our countries. I mean, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of women. Something like 20% of the auto industry, the auto parts industry, is devoted, to plastics production and use. And nobody is studying their health. And we know from the scientific literature that these exposures are quite capable of doing these things and having an enormous effect on their reproductive health as well. And again, there's little or no effort to protect these women or these workers or the communities or the people that live in the vicinity of these plants from these exposures. I can go back and talk about that more later if you want, but, that's what we're looking at right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We do have a caller, though. It looks like our friend Joe Baker. Welcome to the show.
Hello, and thank you. I've been really interested lately whether PVC has this kind of endocrine disruptor in it, because so much of the world has these PVC pipes. The place I'm staying at, they've got a gardening water system, and all the water's running through PVC pipes. Are these kinds of things affecting us that way?
I'm not, to be very frank, I don't know what type of, leaching is taking place out of PVC pipes. I don't know. In other words, are we getting, for instance, BPA, the, bisphenol A, leaching from these pipes into the water supply or not? I don't know the answer to that. What I've been looking at more, I'm aware of some of these issues as they affect, certain populations at risk, like very young children. But where I've been mostly focusing is where are these exposures occurring in occupational settings, because there's very little public attention to this. And there, I think, there is very serious exposure, and it's occurring pretty much on a daily basis. I can tell you in Windsor, Ontario, and I think this is true to the best of my knowledge throughout Ontario, which is the most populous province in Canada, I haven't been able to locate any plastics injection molding machines that has any ventilation attached to it, where there's an attempt to try to take these fumes and gases and exposures that are generated when you heat these PVC pellets or ABS pellets or polypropylene or whatever, and take it away from out of the breathing zone and out of the area to which these workers are employed. And so in those areas, I can tell you for certain there's consistent and I think very high exposures going on a daily basis, and it's being tolerated by government agencies and public health agencies.
Joe, do you have any more questions or comments for our guests? Because we're rolling into a short break here tonight. Jim Brophy. The website is www.toxicfreecanada.ca. Now, Jim, before we went to the break, Joe brought up the water bottle situation. And I know there's been a lot of studies out there and different things that say, number one is okay, but this one isn't. But, I mean, in your educated opinion and all of your decades studying these products, do you drink bottled water?
No. No, I don't.
Okay.
And partly I do it obviously from trying to, as Joe and I were back and forth there discussing how we can, reduce our own exposure to these substances, which we know, are definitely mimicking estrogen and maybe helping to, fuel tumors and cause all kinds of health-related issues. But the other issue, of course, is the whole absurdity of taking these water and transporting it across the globe, when what we really are getting from the tap is every bit as good, and in some cases the bottled water is in fact from the tap. But this is a major issue that's being raised by people like Maud Barlow, who's the chair of the Council of Canadians here. She's actually on a cross-country tour talking about, and I think this is partly what Toxic Free Canada is also engaged in here, is this absurdity of selling bottled water when the consequences of all this plastic that houses this water going into our landfills. And I can't roll off the numbers for you, but I encourage those that are interested to look on the both on the Toxic Free Canada website, but also on the Council of Canadian website, and they can get the background information on this, and it's very disturbing.
Well, I do know that some bottled water is bottled tap water, but at the same time, our tap water contains explosives like fluoride and, of course, mercury, cadmium, lead, arsenic, and on and on. So it's kind of like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. Now, I just realized, as somebody pointed out on the text chat, that the filter I use is with PVC and other sorts of plastic. So now I'm thinking, should I just not filter it at all? Fortunately, I'm not on city water, so I don't have these other toxins. But, I mean, that's really scary. I use my filter. I put all of my, I have a whole bunch of plastic water bottles filled up for, water storage or that I drink throughout the day. Am I being exposed potentially to these toxins?
Well, I think there's no bubble in which we can live in the industrial societies that have been created particularly over the last 200 years in North America and in Europe and parts of Asia and so forth, that we can be immune from these exposures. I mean, plastics, as an example, has become, as a petroleum product, ubiquitous. It's everywhere in our society. I mean, it's shocking if you look around and you see the extent to which, these products are everywhere. Yeah. And we know from biomonitoring in both the United States and in a limited way in Canada that almost the whole human population is carrying traces of these substances in their blood. So there's really almost, it's very interesting just to mention on that part that one of the first studies was done by an organization in Canada called Environmental Defense, and they did this very small sample of people from across the country and looked at a host of chemicals, of 60-some-odd chemicals or so, and everybody and they were carcinogens and endocrine disruptors, and many of these compounds we're talking about now, plasticizers and BPA and phthalates and, the ingredients in Teflon and fire retardants and so on. And almost everyone had them. But the highest exposure with the greatest number of chemicals and the highest levels was actually was found in a First Nations chief who lived up on the Hudson Bay, which is, very close to the North Pole. And you'd say, well, how is that possible? Yeah. Probably it was, from the fish consumption. But it goes to show that we have no one left as a comparison population, because really the whole globe has been exposed to these host of toxic substances that are in consumer products and food products and the air and the water and so on. So I guess all of that is to say, I think we need to reasonably try to reduce our exposure, without, thinking we can do it absolutely, but where it's possible for us to do so, we should. So, in my case, I'm not saying this is perfect, but I don't drink bottled water. I have a filter on my tap at home. I'm conscious about, these exposures in air pollution. I try to avoid them if I can, so on and so forth, and try to, force societal changes that reduce the amount of reliance on these types of products and on these types of industrial activities.
Wow. So, okay, just be honest with me. Is it safe to say that essentially all of these plastics are bad?
Well, certainly the ones that I mentioned previously, the PVC, the vinyl chloride, they've been shown to be, have had very serious health effects on workers, for one thing, which, historically were considered, the kind of the quasi-essential guinea pig for looking at health problems like cancer, because these were highly exposed populations that could be studied. And up to, the 1960s, that's where most cancer research was focused. 95% of the substances that we know cause lung cancer, we know because of the excess mortality of industrial workers that were exposed to these substances. And so, these substances in plastics, and many of them, we know are toxic from epidemiological studies, health studies of industrial workers, although few have focused completely on the plastics industry, but some on the plastics producers, like chemical workers. Some we know from animal studies, where, animals have been exposed, and of course, these were the ones I was raising around, the 216 substances that we know cause mammary tumors in animals, of which the number of the plastics I mentioned, or ingredients in plastics production I've mentioned, and then from global scientific and other work. So I personally think that the plastics pose a great deal of health-related concerns, from bisphenol A in baby bottles to what's going on in the production of bumpers and steering wheels.
Wow. Okay, so, I need to find another way to drink my water then. I mean, are there any plastics that are made without these toxins?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, all right. So I'm switching to glass bottles tonight, right after the show. How funny. Here I am thinking I'm cleaning out my water by using these same materials. Ugh. Wow.
Ironically, your filter and so on, maybe reducing the actual levels of that you're getting. I'm not saying it is, but it may well be. I mean, this is the problem. I think, from my point of view, I think that what I've learned over these 30 years is that we need, major societal change. Not to say we do nothing until we get there, but we need something beyond just, individual changes to really get at this problem. Like, it was very graphic in Sarnia. I think they were producing something like 16 million tons of greenhouse gases a year. And as I mentioned, it was more greenhouse gases than the whole province of British Columbia was generating in Canada. Well, we tried to calculate how many of your light bulbs you have to change over, to the fluorescent light bulbs to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. And, it was like beyond the population of Canada and most of the United States, to even come close to what these group of, 40 or 50 plants were doing. So, what we need to be doing here, we have to go after the major causes of these toxins and of these threats to our existence on the globe. And certainly, control over plastics, I think, is going to become in the years ahead one of the major issues.
Well, and it's not just our water bottles or milk bottles that we need to worry about. It's in toys for our children, cosmetics, what we're putting on our face and some of us are, right. Shampoos, conditioners,
it's inside almost
lotion.
All of the canned foods you get. Bisphenol A was used inside as a coating inside the cans.
Wow. Amazing. So canned food as well. Are there any other products we need to be aware of so that we can avoid?
Well, I think, this is one of the issues. I mean, in Canada, I think you're a little better than you have more protective regulations in the United States, but we're still trying to get some kind of labeling that would force disclosure on these consumer products, to what's being used. There's lots of concerns about, the level of chemical exposures arising from cosmetics and other, personal hygiene products. And many of these, as I said, are found in high concentrations in industrial workplaces. But, in Canada, you buy shampoo and it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you about the substances. Or you buy soap or, whatever.
Yeah. Well, they do that here, too. In fact, other products we've talked about, like aspartame and fluoride, they don't have to list those. In fact, they can get away with it by calling them natural flavors.
Right.
It's ridiculous what they're doing. So toys, shampoos, conditioners, goodness, I'm getting a list here of things to never use again. But I do want to mention for the ladies about cosmetics is we used to have a nurse on the show who would do a column called Ask Olivia. and somebody asked about cosmetics, so she went and researched them thoroughly. And Bare Essentials is one. If I was wearing makeup, that's what I would choose. So it is definitely a better choice compared to Revlon, L'Oreal, and all the other named brands out there. Let me ask you this about shampoos and conditioners. Now, they have some natural ones, like the hemp shampoo. Do you think those still use these chemicals?
I don't know. I know that there's been, there's a number of health groups that have been looking at a host of what we're calling, kind of environmental alternatives, natural products, and some of them are just gravitating toward names that sound as if they're toxic-free when in fact they're not. I'm not an expert in that area, but I know that there's a lot of discussion about it. And I'm actually, I wish actually Margaret was with me now. She's reading a very good book in Canada that's just come out on all of this, that has been talking about all these consumer products.
You know what, though? Now that I think about it, I guess it wouldn't matter if those shampoos and conditioners were toxin-free because they are bottled in plastic. So either way, we're going to get it. Jim, how do you wash your hair?
Well, I'm actually looking around now to find something that I can use that's pretty good,
Wow. That's very scary. I mean, it literally seems like there's nothing we can touch that isn't toxic. Russ is on the line. I'm sure you have a couple questions or comments, Russ.
Good evening, Christie. Thank you. Good evening, Jim.
Hi.
Hey, on this, I have a couple other questions, but on this, do we have scientific evidence that our water bottles are leaching these chemicals into our water or the substance in the container, or is it just the production of these materials, the gases released then, that are making us sick?
No, I mean, well, first of all, I mean, most of what we know about, let's just use the example of bisphenol A, we know through animal studies, its health effects. I mean, it's been known since the 30s that it was very, very powerful estrogenic compound, that it mimicked estrogen. We have not been doing many studies, if any, on highly exposed populations like plastics injection molding workers that are literally using this product every day and being exposed every day. We have been looking at, because of the implications we found in animal studies, particularly in utero exposures, which is, literally, in the womb, and then the effect that it's had later in, say, mice or rat populations, or the different animals that have been studied, the effect that bisphenol A as an estrogenic compound, and how it's increased the risk from everything from, mammary carcinogen or cancer, or a host of other reproductive and developmental health problems. But a recent study that was done in Canada found that 96% of the drinking cans that were tested that had pop or different, soft drinks actually showed signs of bisphenol A in the drink.
If you're still there, if you gentlemen would please continue.
Thank you. You were saying that so it's safe to say that these plastics then, when they're in their final shape, when we get them, are still emitting gases, and those gases are being trapped in the fluids contained in them?
Yes. And, well, I'm not sure of the form, but these chemicals, the molecules of these substances are getting into the product. For instance, in Europe, there was a number of studies done. This was mentioned in the a brochure that Toxic Free Canada has produced around the whole issue of bottled water, about phthalate production, phthalates in leaching into the water. And they're known to cause adverse reproductive effects, even at extremely low levels in animal studies. And they were found.
Well, do you suppose? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Well, please go ahead.
Yeah, were found in the water in these bottles. I mean, there's a host of reasons why, plastic bottles are both pose a serious potential health problems, but also their effect of everything from global warming to what's going in our landfill and what's going in the Pacific Ocean. But yes, these chemicals are being detected in these products. As I mentioned, Health Canada did this big study in which they found, bisphenol A in 26 different, energy drinks and soda pops and so on and so forth that, our children are drinking.
Okay, and these studies are relatively recent, or is this something that's been going on for years? Because today's water has fluoride in it, and fluoride is a very highly explosive substance, and then soda pops are nothing but chemicals, so we have this whole chemical reaction going on. Has there been any studies that differentiate between what we believe to be clean water and these gases and all these other substances, or is it just the bottle?
Well, I'm not as familiar with, kind of the history of looking at water. I mean, I certainly share your concerns about, where all of us are drawing our water from, our freshwater supply. I mean, it's one of the first, things that I think all of us as a species should be concerned about, because life is literally impossible without it. And so if our water supplies are being contaminated, then it really poses a serious, it should be an issue of serious concern for all of us. I guess, my own thinking, and, it's based on, I guess, the research, the work I'm doing, which is not necessarily focusing on water, but on some of these other issues like cancer and endocrine disruption, is that I see the bottled water issue as kind of a cutting edge on the overall issue of our water and how we need to conserve our resources. And what I do see is in these studies, which have been relatively recent, because the issue of endocrine disruption, while it's been out there to some extent, it was only really in the 1990s when Dr. Theo Coburn in the United States and Dr. Peter Myers and others, Dr. Gillette that we were talking about earlier, started documenting the extent of particularly reproductive harm that was occurring at concentrations that were considered too small to really have any effect. And this started taking place in the 1990s, and her book and her website, Our Stolen Future, really are major beacons that are pointed this out. So I don't think it's been an issue that's been out there for 40 or 50 years, but certainly over the last 15 or 20, it is starting to become more and more apparent that our whole way of looking at toxic substances was not clear enough. We didn't take into account not just whether a substance could cause cancer or not, but whether a substance could actually mimic hormones and then change the whole nature of our genetic and chromosomal makeup.
Yeah, we don't pay attention very well, do we? We've been told to believe that most of these chemicals that we're talking about here, that are based on petroleum or oil-based,
yes,
can be also created from hemp, and to our knowledge is not carcinogenic. They're not dangerous. If we were able to make that turn the ship to a hemp-based society, once again, hemp-based world, and we cleaned up our environment, could we recover, in your opinion? We know we can detox.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar, with the alternatives like, here we see, for instance, plastic cups that are, or not plastic cups, cups that are made, for cold drinks that are created from corn. And you can compost them and so on and so forth, which at first glance seems, wow, this is the great alternative to plastics. And maybe it is, and maybe hemp is also one of those alternatives. I think there needs to be, again, and maybe in my uninformed opinion, a real discussion about what the balance is in all of this. I mean, how much soil do we need for food production, which is a major global issue today, and not just the quality of our food, but also its accessibility and availability to, literally, hundreds of millions of people on the globe that are going to bed tonight malnourished. So what balance we have and how we do all of this is a large discussion of which, I think, maybe people associated with this program and like yourself may have a better understanding than I do. But I certainly see that this issue of, environmental and exposure to toxic substances is having a huge effect both on the health of our species and the species we share the planet with, but ultimately with the sustainability of the whole planet.
Humanity.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to say, getting back to how much space do we need for food and energy and this and that, I want to point out, according to Henry Ford, I'm going to read a quote. He says, there's enough alcohol in 1 year's yield of an acre of potatoes to drive the machinery necessary to cultivate the fields for 100 years. So 1 acre of potatoes will give you enough energy for 100 years.
Well, we have options. Good for old Henry. It's funny that if they saw that then, I guess oil was just a lot cheaper than an acre of potatoes, I guess, from their point of view. But I think the plastic products we're using and the oil we're using to fuel the energy in our economy are diminishing rapidly, and we're going to have to find some serious alternatives, and we have to be thinking about the health implications and the effects that these alternatives, which I think we're going to have to go to regardless of whether they like it or not, are going to be both safe and also they're not going to harm other people. In other words, take the food. This is one of the big issues I would think around ethanol production. Are we going to start, to produce corn not to feed people, but to, fuel our cars? So are our people in North America and in Europe, Japan, going to have their cars running fine, but people in the rest of the globe are not going to have food?
We need to plant hemp today and solve all of our world problems. Oh, wow.
Well, no, but there's back to the bottles and the containers, and you mentioned the landfill thing, Jim, and that's what I understand is this stuff isn't biodegradable. You can put it in the landfill, and 100 years from now, it's going to still be in the landfill. So I don't understand how it can release something forever and not deteriorate. I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me, and it's a rhetorical question, I guess.
Well, it's releasing it into the water. They're kind of separate issues. The question is, do some of these chemicals, bisphenol A as an example, actually migrate to the water? Migrate, to bottled water or to, pop or whatever the product is inside the container. And the studies show that it does. The other question is that you have in these landfills, increasingly taking over and more space and also, not degrading these essentially petroleum byproducts like bottled water. And they're contributing enormously to our problem of hazardous waste and toxic and dumped in landfill sites.
When you and Russ were talking, I'm thinking, okay, now what about our vegetables, that we say grate the zucchini or wrap them in plastic and put them in the freezer? Then I started thinking, well, my goodness, all of my food storage, predominantly, most of it is plastic, Tupperware and such, saran wrap. It is literally, it almost seems unavoidable, these toxins.
The use of plastics has become so ubiquitous, it's almost impossible to avoid it. And, it's a real, and the effects, what are these low-level exposures having? What's the effect? And who's the populations at risk? These are huge questions that really need to be addressed on a much larger societal basis. I'm hoping just looking at a very small portion of this in the breast cancer study or what we saw with the Amjanon First Nations in Sarnia may be part of, an ongoing series of wake-up calls that force people to think about these things now. I wonder, Christie, if I could raise one other question that we haven't talked about, and I'm particularly mindful of it given that, a good deal of the audience here is from the United States. And that is I don't know if you're aware about the ongoing problem of asbestos-related disease in both our countries, but particularly about the role that Canada has been playing in keeping the global asbestos industry alive. Because
I did want to mention that to you, so I'm so glad you brought it up. You had a wonderful article about high school students, 3 young ladies who inspired a draft bill to ban asbestos exports. And we've definitely heard a little bit about that, but please fill us in on the rest of the gory details.
Well, Canada has been, for most of the 20th century, the leading exporter of asbestos. And this industry is very much like the tobacco industry. It, manufactured all kinds of uncertainty about its products. It corrupted, for literally for decades, the scientific process and kept out of the public view the real effects of its product. And this is what, emerged mostly actually in the United States in congressional testimonies in the 1960s and 70s, where the asbestos industry, under subpoena and in court cases, was forced to disclose how they knew about the harm that they were causing for decades, into the 30s and 40s, and were not telling anyone. And so today, almost all industrialized countries have banned the use of asbestos. It's banned throughout the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, in fact, Canada. Now, in the United States, it's not officially banned, but in practice, nobody will really wants to use it. It's the biggest single issue in front of tort, biggest legal tort issue in the United States. There was a bill in the Senate a few years ago to ban asbestos, but it failed because they thought that $150 billion, which was what was being put aside to cover the compensation costs for people with asbestos disease, was not sufficient enough, because in the United States it's something between, I think it's 10 to 20,000 people.
Well, Jim, hold that thought. I'm sorry to cut you off before we went in that last break, but if you would just please continue.
Well, thank you, Christie, for letting me. I guess this will really be our last segment, I guess. Just mention that this whole really global issue of asbestos related disease. It's been described, asbestos has been described as probably the most pervasive environmental contaminant that we now have in the world. The World Health Organization is estimating that over 100,000 people are dying of asbestos-related diseases each year globally. Wow. And unfortunately, Canada, which is not using asbestos domestically, is shipping about 95% of the asbestos produced here to developing countries. And asbestos disease, I think, asbestos use has been, well publicized in the United States. As I said, the American Congress almost passed a ban a few years ago, but it got kind of sideswiped because the compensation costs weren't considered adequate, because they want the asbestos issue out of the court system. I was driving, Margaret and I were driving last week, to Ann Arbor, which is about 50 miles from here, and we saw 2 billboards on the way from law firms that are doing nothing but asbestos litigation in the United States, because it's such a huge issue. And so that's why the World Health Organization, the Canadian Cancer Society, the Canadian Medical Journal, not to mention the World Health Organization, the International Agency on the Research of Cancer, IARC, all of these groups are calling for a global ban on the use of asbestos. And unfortunately, Canada is a major contributor to keeping this discredited industry alive. And I just feel, since I'm, have this opportunity to speak, to people in the United States, that I raise it, because it would be a tremendous use, and it would be a tremendous force and help for those of us in Canada that are fighting to have this asbestos industry literally stopped, and to help the miners that are still producing this material in Quebec assisted with a just transition to some other economic activity, that if you were to be raising the question of Canada's role in the global asbestos market, that would be unbelievably important for us. There is a recent documentary that was shown on the national news on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, a 20-minute documentary by a woman named Melissa Fung. And she went to India and showed how Canadian asbestos is being used in India. And it was absolutely horrific to see these people literally covered in asbestos dust and debris, and knowing that the kinds of exposures that they're getting will produce a whole array of cancers and respiratory diseases, which are some of the most excruciating and tragic of all cancers, such as mesothelioma, which is a cancer of the lining of the lung, and a person literally suffocates to death from it. And so if I just thought I should raise this, and as I said before, when you and I were talking earlier, this was an issue that really dominated my time and energies while I was working in Sarnia, because among the industrial workers in Sarnia, we were, for the last 4 years I was there, registering a new case of mesothelioma, lung cancer, or asbestosis every week. And in the last 2 years I was there, we were registering almost a new patient every day with some form of asbestos-related disease. So
amazing. You know, it's almost like if anyone's paying attention, all of these toxins and neurotoxins, cancer-causing agents, and you know, these chemicals, it's almost like they're doing it on purpose. I mean, it can't be just a coincidence that everything they're feeding us, kills people or genocides certain populations.
Well, I mean, I think, as we were describing earlier, the driver in our economy doesn't really have on its radar the health impacts and the social impacts that its product may create. The value of the particular product is based on how much profit it generates. And so we're left with this. This is the system that has dominated, Western Europe and Western society, for the last 300 or 400 years. And so, this is a problem. But in my work, particularly in occupational and environmental health, one thing I've seen very clearly is that if it's blue-collar workers and their communities that are, by and large, bearing the brunt of and the burden of disease caused by producing these things, then by and large it's tolerated and accepted as kind of a social, unfortunate, but a social necessity in order to provide the standard of living that we think we're accustomed to. And so, we've tolerated literally for decades exposures to people in these industrial environments that we know will cause adverse health effects. And until we change, the nature of our society that is not prepared to harm one section of the population so another can benefit, then I think these stories that we've been talking about today are very likely to continue.
Very good, Jim. I want to thank you so much for your time. We have about 30 seconds left. Is there anything we didn't touch on tonight that is important to get out to the listeners?
Well, I think I kind of indicated it with the breast cancer work we're doing, but the other area besides this burden of, particularly of among industrial and blue-collar workers, within that category, you certainly have women that are bearing a disproportionate health burden from these exposures that we've been talking about. And I think...